Okay, so the Americans involved in trade as far as World War I were concerned were primarily assisting the Allies. Most of the trade, almost all the trade went to the Allies. All the loans went to the Allies. So clearly it was a biased neutrality as far as the war was concerned. Now the Germans, of course, saw this situation, and they had they didn't have the equivalent situation for themselves. There's no sugar daddy for Germany, no place that they can turn to. So the Germans saw that this was, of course, very detrimental to their well-being, and it became an essential German war aim to try to stop the trade between the Allies and the United States of America. And they will respond to this problem very quickly in terms of the war. And in the year 1915, they will begin to introduce this campaign that they're going to call unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare. And this becomes a critical component of what will ultimately draw the United States into World War I. Now, what the Germans are going to do is they're going to use this relatively new weapon of stealth. I find it very interesting that, today, I think really from World War II on, the United States is the largest user of submarines, of course. And submarines today are just extraordinarily dangerous weapons, right? It's not that they have torpedoes, they're going to sink ships, but they're loaded with nuclear missiles, and they're just lurking all over the world, and they can send, missiles wherever they want to go necessarily. So, today the United States is the primary user of submarines. But, this was a new weapon of stealth that was coming out at this time, and I have to tell you that, of course, if you look back to the entire history of the submarine, and if someone wanted to do a history project on that, that'd be a good idea, especially the American perspective on this. I just recently read an article on a submarine that was used by the Confederacy that they have located. And the submarine was just a hand-operated, had a particular amount of air inside of it, just a big tube, and they would hand drive. All the men would sit on one side, hand cranking, of course, and that would counterbalance. I can't remember the weight of the propeller or something like that. And all they really did was they had a long boom at the very end of the submarine that would have an explosive. And the idea was to go up to a ship, in a stealth manner, connect the mine basically to the ship, and then back away. And apparently when they did actually deploy this in this situation, they did get to be backed away, and the mine exploded, and it ultimately causes, of course, the sinking of the submarine. But they found the submarine, and they were trying to determine, of course, what it was that killed everyone. And you would assume, of course, it could be the blast, of course, it could be drowning ultimately. But every single man on this submarine that was doing that hand crank, and these are Confederates during the Civil War, was just sort of sitting in a kind of resting, almost a relaxed situation, holding on to their cranks. Of course, these are just the bones. So no significant disturbance, essentially, of their body by the blast. And it became, did they just simply have this very relaxed situation when they died or whatever? But a person has done an intense study upon this and just believes it's the shock wave. The shock wave came through the water, came through the hull, and just it blew out their brains basically. And none of them had even a second to even contemplate this. So they didn't drown. And in some ways, that's a kinder instantaneous death that they. But so there were submarines. And I think there's even kind of like a wooden submarine device that was used during the American Revolutionary War. But the first time they're really going to be deployed in a significant way in warfare is World War I. Now the Germans had built for themselves a very substantial high seas fleet, and was in some ways able to challenge the British. And they did come out one time to challenge the British. This is the Battle of Jutland, or Jutland, however they say that, in 1916. This is off of Denmark. And the two major battle fleets, and of course it was at that time it became such a weird battle. In the good old days of the ships of the line, they would come up next to each other and just try to shoot cannon at each other, blow each other away. But now these ships have huge cannon that can shoot from miles, so they're like blowing each other away, but from 10 miles apart or something like, a very different kind of situation. In the Battle of Jutland, the British actually lost more tonnage and men, but the Germans basically kind of decided they couldn't really challenge the British, so the High Fleet goes in and never comes out again, and instead the Germans decided to rely upon, of course, the weapon of stealth, which was the U-boat. And, the U-boat, it kind of broke the rules in many ways in terms of how you were supposed to conduct international war or warfare. In the good old days, of course, you could sink a cargo ship. That wasn't illegitimate. But you had to come by, if a warship comes up, they'd have to see the cargo ship. They would fire a shot across the bow to let the ship know that they had heaved to. They would then send a party from the naval vessel to the cargo ship to determine whether or not there was contraband. And if there was contraband, you either can take it, of course, they would take it as a prize, or you could sink it if you wanted to. But before you sunk it, you had to remove all of the crew. You'd have to take the people off that ship, Now, the submarine couldn't play that game. They did have these small cannon mounted sometimes on the top of the hull, but they were dirt slow and they were targets basically. And so cargo ships with one cannon could actually do damage to a submarine. So the whole issue of the submarine, I'm sure you guys know, is the stealth issue. They're going to be down underwater. They're going to have their periscope up there checking out to see, if there's going to be. And the first thing you know that there's a submarine by is you're getting a torpedo on the side. The whole idea. And it's intriguing that Wilson saw this as, an immoral, nefarious form of warfare. The Americans will ultimately embrace this. Absolutely, just about everyone's going to embrace this sucker. Okay, but here's what's going to happen in terms of 1915. The Germans decide that they can use their U-boats as a way to try to stop the flow of goods and services from the United States. And again, as I suggested to you, they're going to declare unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915. What they did, and here's me being my funky self again, but I don't have any alternatives. They're going to declare a war zone all around the British Isles. So this is the British Isles, as you can see them, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And around the entire area, just picture a circle drawn around that entire area, that was declared a war zone. And the British declared that within that war zone, they had the right to, they would sink every unrestricted, nothing to restrict them from sinking whatever is going through at that particular time. So, they're declaring the British Isles a war zone, and they're just letting the entire world know, if you venture into that zone, you are subject to be sunk. Now, the primary targets were, of course, cargo ships and warships. These are the primary targets. But, they created the possibility that other ships could be sunk. And, of course, the most important alternative situation here is passenger ships, ships that are just carrying human people, of course, maybe even carrying neutrals on these ships, found themselves at risk to be sunk. And indeed, that will prove to be the case and becomes critical in terms of the Americans becoming part of this war. So, unrestricted submarine warfare is declared that's January of 1915. In March of 1915, and of course the Germans start to sink ships. In March of 1916, there is a passenger ship that is sunk, and that ship was called the Falaba. And the Falaba, I'm pretty sure, maybe had one or two Americans on board. Neither one were killed, but it creates this kind of suggestion that this is a situation where Americans might run afoul run afoul of warfare. So anyway, a passenger ship was indeed sunk. Now, in May of 1915, another sinking is going to occur, and this is the one, of course, that will have a huge impact. It will become one of the most famous sinkings in the history of the modern era, of course, and critically important as far as America is concerned. And it involves the sinking of this very large passenger liner, which was called I'm going to give you guys a chance to guess, 1, 2, 3, the Lusitania. So the sinking of the Lusitania, of course, becomes this critical moment in what will begin the process of U.S. entry into World War I. The Lusitania is going to be a potential identification for us, okay? So, sinking of Lusitania, May the 7th, 1915. Now, the Lusitania at that time was one of the largest, it was the largest passenger ship in the entire world. Now, I'm telling you that it is true that it was the largest passenger ship, but I want you to know that it had a twin called the Mauretania. So these two ships were both of them the largest passenger ships in the world. They hadn't been the largest passenger ships in the world in 1912 because a bigger passenger ship had been constructed at that time. But I'm sure you guys know in 1912 that ship went out onto the Atlantic Ocean, ran into an iceberg, and sunk. So when the Titanic sank, of course, the Lusitania, the Mauretania retained their position as being the largest passenger ships in the world. Not only the largest, but the fastest passenger ship too. It could go 25 knots, which is pretty amazing when you contemplate moving that much of a ship, of course. If you want to have an image of the Lusitania, just think about the Titanic. They were the same kind of thing. Remember that they were passenger ships, not cruise ships. That was the only way you could get across the Atlantic Ocean, so you go on a passenger ship. And of course they had, they took all kinds of passenger, from the very wealthy to the relatively poor. And so they had this, structure of class, depending on, where you were in the ship. And first class, of course, those are the things we see a lot of course, in the movie Titanic, just all the opulence of their dining areas and their cabins, etc. Second class, not too bad. Third class, you're getting down lower in the ship, of course, getting a little shallower. Fourth class, fifth class, Those guys are way down below the waterline, of course, so you don't even want a port window because you're looking out to see the octopus or something like that, you know. And there were even those that were in steerage. They just were kind of having to hang out among the cargo. And of course, those in the lower classes were denied access, of course, to many of the decks where, you know, the more opulent manifestations would be. So, you know, it was 750 feet long, of course. I can't remember what the size of the beam. It was almost like a little, you know, that'd be kind of like a, I don't know what, more than a quarter mile if you walked the entire upper deck, if you went around the entire ship. So, a very substantial sailing vessel at that time. But the largest and fastest passenger ship in the world. The pride of the Cunard Line. The Cunard Line is a famous shipping company. They continue to be there even to this day. The Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mary, the QE2, all those are part of the the Cunard Line, which remains in America. But the story involves, of course, this particular ship called the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania had a regular run that it would do. It would go from Liverpool to New York and back, just go back, generally taking about a week to go each way. And it just carrying people, because, you know, people needed to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and this was one of the ways you could make this happen on the Lusitania. So the Lusitania was in New York. It's going to leave out of New York Harbor on May the 1st, 1915. And, you know, they would always do all that fanfare where the ship would leave, and of course, and the people throwing Confederate streamers and stuff like that. I did want to say that on the day before, there was an announcement of the departure of the Lusitania that was printed in the New York Times. And the intriguing thing, it just tells, you know, that all passengers have to be there at such and such a time, that kind of thing. But right next to it, smaller and all kind of in dark, was a little ad that was placed by the German Imperial Embassy. And the embassy made a statement there, of course, you know, it said that this ship is entering into a war zone and is subject to, you know, potential damages or something like that. So a foreshadowing of what will happen to the Lusitania. That juxtapositioning of the ads has been, you know, pictured in textbook after textbook. There's a fairly famous picture if you ever want to take a look at that thing. Anyway, so the Lusitania leaves out of New York Harbor, full contingent basically of passengers essentially on its way to Liverpool. By all accounts, the passage was pretty nice. It was May, of course. You know, it can be rough in the Northern Atlantic, but apparently day after day of relative sunny conditions, everything seemed to be going on well. But as they began to approach the British Isle, they began to get on the wireless messages of the potential of sinking activities that were occurring in the southern part, in the southern approaches to the Irish Sea. So Cummings, just below Ireland, of course, on your way into the area between Ireland and England proper. And there were 3 sighted sinkings that had occurred during that time. And one of the interesting things is that the Lusitania did nothing to avoid this. You know, you can think of a number of evasive measures. You could go faster. Those U-boats were dirt slow. They ran on batteries. They could go like, you know, 1 or 2 knots underwater, so they're not very quick at all. You could go in a zigzag pattern. These are the kind of things that they'll begin to do much more of course, later on in the war and in World War II. They could have gone north. They could have gone north of Ireland instead of south of Ireland. But the captain decided, you know, not to make any kind of alterations at all and just simply streamed straight into the Irish Sea. I'm going to pause for just a second here. I've got to go say something to my daughter.